So there I was, Marcus Flynn, 22 years old and supposedly the luckiest college senior in the galaxy. Why lucky? Because I'd somehow landed an internship at the Galactic Council's premier diplomatic station, New Geneva. And by somehow, I mean my Aunt Linda works in HR and put in a good word. Don't judge me. Nepotism is a time-honored human tradition, right up there with pizza and complaining about the weather. New Geneva wasn't your typical space station. Picture the United Nations building, but floating in the void between 3 solar systems, and with significantly better cafeteria food. The place was designed to look impressive and peaceful, all gleaming white corridors and panoramic windows showing off the star-speckled darkness of space. Very zen, very diplomatic, very much not working. See, for the past 3 months, the station had been hosting what was generously called a diplomatic negotiation, but which more accurately resembled a cosmic-scale toddler tantrum. On one side, you had the Razorclaw Empire, a collection of warrior species who solved most problems by hitting them with increasingly large sticks. On the other side was the Fluffington Collective, a group of species so committed to politeness and proper procedure that they once spent 6 hours debating the appropriate way to say hello before a meeting. The issue? Mining rights to an asteroid belt that contained enough rare minerals to power half the galaxy's technology for the next century. Simple problem, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Catastrophically, bureaucratically, mind-numbingly wrong. Ambassador Patricia Goldstein, Earth's top diplomatic representative, and a woman who could negotiate peace between cats and dogs if she put her mind to it, was slowly losing what remained of her sanity. I'd seen her in the hallways, muttering to herself about proper protocols and cultural sensitivity training. The woman had successfully mediated 17 interspecies conflicts, but this one was breaking her. And where was I in all this galactic drama? Fetching coffee, filing reports, occasionally being asked to make photocopies of documents I wasn't important enough to read. My official title was Administrative Assistant Intern, which in diplomatic speak meant college kid who gets paid in experience and the occasional lunch voucher. The thing is, when you're invisible, you see everything. While Ambassador Goldstein and her team of seasoned diplomats ran themselves ragged trying every negotiation technique in the book, I watched from the sidelines. I delivered their 15th pot of coffee of the day. I listened to them complain in the break room about impossible species and their impossible demands. And honestly, the whole situation seemed pretty stupid to me. But what did I know? I was just the intern who couldn't even operate the fancy coffee machine without setting off 3 different safety alarms. The seasoned diplomats had tried everything. Formal mediation sessions with carefully arranged seating charts, cultural exchange presentations complete with PowerPoint slides, even a disastrous attempt at a joint dinner that ended with someone throwing what, I'm pretty sure, was supposed to be a peace offering across the room. Meanwhile, I was learning that galactic diplomacy was apparently 90% paperwork and 10% very polite arguing. The other interns and I had started a betting pool on which species would storm out of negotiations first on any given day. I was up 12 credits, which was more progress than the actual diplomats were making. But hey, at least the view from the observation deck was nice. Now, you might be wondering how a coffee-fetishing intern managed to stumble into the most important diplomatic crisis in recent galactic history. The answer is simple. I got lost. Again. New Geneva was designed by someone who clearly thought that having 17 different levels connected by a maze of corridors would somehow promote contemplative navigation. What it actually promoted was me wandering around like an idiot with a tray of coffee trying to find conference room 7 alpha whatever. So there I was, balancing 3 cups of Ambassador Goldstein's special blend, when I took what I thought was a shortcut through the main diplomatic wing. I pushed open what I assumed was a supply closet door and walked straight into the primary negotiation chamber during what appeared to be a Category 5 diplomatic meltdown. The first thing that hit me was the noise. Not shouting exactly, but the kind of aggressively controlled voices that somehow sound more terrifying than actual screaming. The second thing that hit me was the sight of General Krax of the Razorclaw Empire. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a 7-foot-tall alligator that decided to hit the gym, learned to walk upright, and then got really into military history. General Krax had scales that looked like they could deflect small-caliber weapons, claws that could probably open cans without a can opener, and a voice that sounded like gravel being processed in a cement mixer. He was currently explaining, in vivid detail, exactly what his empire thought about the Fluffington Collective's latest proposal. "Your terms are weaker than a hatchling's first roar," Krax was saying, punctuating each word by stabbing the conference table with one massive claw. "You speak of shared resources like a scavenger begs for scraps. The Razorclaw Empire does not beg." Sitting across from this walking nightmare was High Counselor Whiskers McFluff. And yes, that was apparently their actual name. If General Cracks was designed by someone who thought subtle intimidation meant chainsaw sculpture, then Whiskers was created by someone who'd never met a pastel color they didn't love. 3 feet tall, covered in what looked like the galaxy's fluffiest lavender fur, with ears that could probably pick up radio signals from 3 systems away, they were currently wringing their tiny paws and speaking in a voice that sounded like a kindergarten teacher having a nervous breakdown. General Cracks, with all due respect to your cultural traditions and deeply held beliefs, Whiskers was saying, your approach lacks the nuanced consideration of all stakeholders' emotional investment in this negotiation process. Perhaps we could explore alternative frameworks that honor both our people's fundamental needs while maintaining the integrity of our shared commitment to peaceful coexistence. That sentence took 43 seconds to deliver, I counted. Ambassador Goldstein was sitting at the head of the table, looking like someone who'd been asked to referee a fight between a tornado and a therapy session. Her usually perfect composure was cracking around the edges, and I could see her left eye twitching in a way that suggested she was considering career alternatives. And that's when disaster struck. Well, more disaster. I tried to back out of the room quietly, but apparently the universe had other plans. My foot caught on the door threshold, I stumbled forward, and 3 cups of Ambassador Goldstein's special blend went airborne in a spectacular arc that would have been impressive if it hadn't landed directly on the conference table's holographic display of the disputed asteroid belt. The room went dead silent. General Cracks stared at me like I was a particularly interesting insect he was considering stepping on. Whiskers McFluff's ears drooped so far they touched the table. Ambassador Goldstein's eye stopped twitching, probably because her entire nervous system had just shut down in self-defense. I said, demonstrating the diplomatic eloquence that had gotten me this job. Sorry? And then, because apparently my mouth had disconnected from my brain, I added, you know, from the outside, this whole thing seems kind of stupid. The silence that followed could have been packaged and sold as a weapon of mass destruction. But here's the weird part. General Cracks's expression shifted from murderous reptile to something that might have been curiosity. Whiskers McFluff stopped wringing their paws and tilted their head, like they were actually listening. And Ambassador Goldstein? Ambassador Goldstein looked at me like I'd just suggested setting the station on fire, but also like she was genuinely considering it. Intern Flynn, she said slowly, perhaps you'd like to explain what you mean by that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how I accidentally became the most unqualified diplomatic advisor in galactic history. So there I was, standing in a puddle of coffee, being stared down by a giant lizard warrior and a therapy-obsessed space rabbit, while my boss contemplated whether firing me or promoting me would cause less paperwork. Fun times. Well, Intern Flynn, Ambassador Goldstein said, using the tone that diplomats reserve for diffusing nuclear situations. Since you've already interrupted these proceedings, perhaps you'd care to elaborate on your assessment of the situation. Now, most people in my position would have apologized profusely, cleaned up the mess, and slunk away to update their resume. But here's the thing about being 22 and caffeinated on 3 hours of sleep. Sometimes your brain just decides to go for broke. Look, I said, gesturing at the coffee-soaked hologram that was still flickering between images of asteroids and error messages. You guys have been at this for 3 months, right? And from what I can tell, you're basically arguing about who gets to dig up rocks in space. Meanwhile, General Cracks keeps talking like he's planning to invade something, and Counselor Whiskers keeps apologizing for existing. No offense. General Cracks's eyes narrowed to slits that could have cut glass. You dare suggest that the Razorclaw Empire's righteous claim to strategic resources is mere rock-collecting small human? And I must express my concern, Whiskers added, their voice trembling like a leaf in a hurricane, that this characterization, while perhaps unintentionally hurtful, may not fully encompass the complex emotional and cultural dimensions of our people's deeply held convictions regarding territorial stewardship and resource management protocols. I blinked. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Ambassador Goldstein leaned forward. Explain. General Cracks, you're not actually planning to invade anyone, are you? You just want your people to know you fought hard for those mining rights because that's what Razorclaw leaders do. And Whiskers, you're not actually weak or indecisive. You're just trying to make sure everyone feels heard because that's what good Fluffington leaders do. But you're both so busy performing your cultures at each other that you're missing the actual problem. The room was quiet except for the soft humming of the station's life support systems. I was pretty sure I could hear my career dying, but hey, in for a penny, in for a pound. The razor claws think politeness means weakness, I continued. So every time Whiskers tries to be considerate, Cracks thinks they're being manipulative or cowardly. And the Fluffingtons think directness means hostility. So every time Cracks states a position clearly, Whiskers thinks they're being attacked. You're not having a negotiation. You're having two completely different conversations in the same room. General Cracks was now staring at me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly challenging puzzle. Whiskers had gone very still, their ears twitching in what I was learning to recognize as deep thought. Ambassador Goldstein cleared her throat. That's actually not entirely inaccurate. But Marcus, understanding cultural barriers and overcoming them are two very different things. We've tried cultural sensitivity training, translation protocols, even meditation sessions. Yeah, but you're trying to fix it with more formal diplomacy, I said. What if you tried the opposite? The opposite of diplomacy, Whiskers squeaked. But surely that would be chaos. Not chaos, just informal. Look, back on Earth, some of our best negotiations happen over dinner or drinks or card games. People relax, they stop performing. They start talking like actual people instead of representatives of galactic powers with important positions. General Cracks snorted, which was a sound like a steam engine having an attitude problem. You suggest we abandon the honored protocols of formal discourse for games? I suggest you try something that hasn't failed spectacularly for 3 months, I shot back, then immediately wondered if talking back to a 7-foot lizard warrior was covered under the intern health insurance plan. But instead of eating me, Cracks laughed. Actually laughed. It sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountain, but it was definitely amusement. The small human has courage. I respect this. Whiskers was practically vibrating with anxiety. But the proper procedures, the established frameworks, the carefully negotiated protocols for interspecies communication haven't worked, I said gently. Look, what if we tried just one informal session? No official records, no formal positions, just, I don't know, pizza and poker? Get to know each other as people instead of diplomatic positions? Ambassador Goldstein was looking at me like I'd suggested juggling live grenades. Marcus, this is a multi-trillion credit resource dispute involving two major galactic powers. We can't just wing it. With respect, Ambassador, I said, using the phrase Whiskers had taught me meant, I'm about to say something you won't like. Winging it has to be better than whatever this is. I gestured at the coffee-stained disaster that was the current negotiations setup. The holographic display was still flickering error messages. Both delegations looked exhausted and frustrated. Ambassador Goldstein looked like she was contemplating early retirement. Home session? I pressed. Informal, no pressure. If it doesn't work, you can go back to the formal approach and I'll go back to fetching coffee. But if it does work... General Cracks was studying me with those predatory eyes. You would gamble the future of galactic resource allocation on human card games and processed cheese bread. I'd gamble it on the chance that you two might actually like each other if you met as people instead of job titles. Whiskers made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a laugh. That's surprisingly optimistic for such an unconventional approach. Ambassador Goldstein closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them, she looked like a woman who'd decided to jump out of a perfectly good starship. Calm session, she said. Informal, off the record. If this blows up in our faces, Flynn, you're not just fired, you're exiled to the Outer Rim. Deal, I said, trying to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. And that's how I convinced the galaxy's most important diplomats to try solving interstellar conflict with pizza night. 48 hours later, I was standing in New Geneva's recreation room, wondering if this was how people felt right before they accidentally started galactic wars. The rec room was usually reserved for off-duty station personnel to play ping-pong and complain about their jobs. Tonight, it was hosting what might have been the most important poker game in galactic history. I'd spent 2 days preparing, which mostly involved Googling how to not get eaten by alien diplomats and ordering enough pizza to feed a small army. The station's kitchen staff thought I was planning some kind of intern party. If only they knew. General Cracks arrived first, ducking through the doorway like a dragon entering a dollhouse. He was still wearing his ceremonial armor, which seemed like overkill for cards, but I wasn't about to critique the fashion choices of someone who could bench press a shuttle. This space is smaller than I anticipated, he rumbled, looking around at the casual furniture and recreational equipment like he'd never seen such things before. More intimate, I said, trying to sound confident. Good for conversation. Whiskers McFluff appeared in the doorway next, practically hidden behind an armload of what appeared to be formal documentation. I brought the preliminary cultural exchange protocols and the interspecies social interaction guidelines, just in case we need to reference appropriate behavioral frameworks during our informal discourse session. Or, I suggested gently, we could just wing it and see what happens. The look of pure horror on Whisker's face was immediately replaced by what might have been curiosity. Wing it. That's a colloquial expression meaning to proceed without extensive preparation, correct? How terrifying and fascinating. Ambassador Goldstein was the last to arrive, looking like someone who'd spent the day explaining to her superiors why she was letting an intern conduct diplomacy via snack foods. She surveyed the scene with the expression of someone watching a controlled demolition that might not be as controlled as advertised. The pizza is on its way, I announced, because apparently that was my life now. Who knows how to play poker? General Crack's laugh could have registered on seismic equipment. You assume warriors do not understand games of strategy and deception? The Razorclaw Empire has been perfecting such contests for millennia. Oh dear, Whiskers murmured. Deception seems rather confrontational? Perhaps we could try something more collaborative? Maybe a nice, cooperative puzzle game? Poker it is, I said quickly, before this could devolve into a debate about game theory. But first, pizza. The delivery arrived 20 minutes later, and watching 3 species encounter Earth cuisine for the first time was worth the price of admission. General Cracks approached the boxes like they might contain explosives, while Whiskers spent 5 minutes reading the ingredients list aloud. Processed tomato sauce, fermented dairy product, processed wheat flour, Whiskers recited. This seems remarkably efficient from a nutritional standpoint. It's not about efficiency, I said, opening the boxes to release clouds of cheesy steam. It's about comfort food. Food you eat when you want to relax and feel good. General Cracks tentatively picked up a slice, examined it from multiple angles, then took a bite that could have consumed half the pizza in one go. His expression went through several rapid changes before settling on something that might have been approval. This is surprisingly satisfying, he admitted. The combination of flavors suggests careful strategic planning. It's just cheese and tomatoes on bread, I said. Yes, but the proportions are clearly designed for maximum effectiveness. Efficient fuel with pleasant delivery method, your species shows wisdom in this area. Meanwhile, Whiskers was approaching their slice with the delicate precision of a surgeon, taking tiny bites and making small, appreciative sounds. The warmth is quite comforting, and the social aspect of sharing from a common source has interesting implications for community building. Right, I said, dealing out cards before this could turn into a lecture on food anthropology. Basic poker. 5 cards, standard betting rules, except we're playing for... I paused, realizing I hadn't thought about stakes. Honor, General Crocs declared immediately. Oh my, Whiskers said. That seems rather intense for a casual game. How about information? I suggested. Winner of each hand gets to ask the others a question. Nothing classified, nothing that violates your diplomatic positions, just personal stuff. Get to know each other. Ambassador Goldstein raised an eyebrow. That's actually not terrible. The first few hands were tentative. Cracks played poker like he conducted military campaigns, with aggressive betting and obvious tells when he was bluffing. Whiskers approached each decision with careful statistical analysis, calculating odds with the precision of a computer. I was just trying not to embarrass humanity too badly. But then something interesting started happening. General, I said after winning a hand with a pair of 7s. What's your favorite part of being in the military? Cracks considered this while demolishing another slice of pizza. The clarity, he said finally. When facing an enemy, you know exactly where you stand. No hidden meanings, no complex social protocols. Victory or defeat. Simple. Whiskers' ears perked up. But surely military leadership requires understanding complex social dynamics within your own forces. Of course, Cracks nodded. But with my people, directness is respected. When I say attack, they attack. When I say retreat, they retreat. When I say this pizza is acceptable, they know I approve of the food choice. This must be refreshing, Whiskers said wistfully. In Fluffington society, we often spend considerable time interpreting what people really mean when they communicate. This pizza is acceptable might mean anything from, this is adequate to, this is wonderful but I don't want to seem overly enthusiastic. Why would you not want to seem enthusiastic about something you enjoy? Cracks asked, genuinely puzzled. Because excessive enthusiasm might make others feel pressured to match your excitement level, or could be interpreted as dismissive of alternative food preferences, or might suggest that you're not considering the feelings of those who contributed to the meal preparation. But you clearly enjoy the pizza. Krax interrupted. I can observe this, why not simply state it? And that's when I saw it. The exact moment when two completely different worldviews started to make sense to each other. Whiskers, I said, winning the next hand with a straight, what's the best part of your job? Helping people feel heard, they said without hesitation. When someone brings a concern to the council, even if we can't solve their problem immediately, we can make sure they know their voice matters, that their perspective has value. General Krax was studying Whiskers with new interest. This is strategic thinking. You maintain loyalty and morale by ensuring all voices contribute to the overall mission effectiveness. Well, yes, although I wouldn't phrase it quite so militaristically, but essentially correct. And you, Whiskers said to Krax after winning a hand with 3 kings, how do you handle disagreements within your own military structure? Direct challenge, Krax said promptly. If a subordinate disagrees with strategy, they state their position clearly. We discuss. Best idea wins. No hidden resentments, no unspoken concerns. That sounds terrifying, Whiskers admitted. But also, efficient? Very efficient. Though it requires trust that disagreement is not personal attack. Ambassador Goldstein, who had been quietly observing this cultural exchange while methodically losing at poker, cleared her throat. This is actually the most productive cross-cultural communication I've seen in 3 months. Because we're not trying to be diplomatic, I realized. We're just being people who happen to eat pizza and play cards. That's when the real breakthrough happened. Whiskers, emboldened by several successful poker hands and what I suspected was a mild sugar high from the pizza, looked directly at General Krax. General, when you speak so forcefully in negotiations, are you actually angry with us? Or is that simply how Razorclaw leaders communicate important information? Fisk cracked his massive head tilted. Communication style. When stakes are high, clarity becomes essential. Soft words can be misunderstood. But you interpret this as hostility? We interpret forceful communication as a sign that emotional regulation has failed and conflict escalation is imminent. And we interpret excessive politeness as weakness or potential deception. They stared at each other across the card table, pizza boxes and poker chips scattered between them, and I watched 3 months of diplomatic gridlock evaporate in real time. So, Krax said slowly, when you spend considerable time acknowledging all perspectives and expressing concern for cultural sensitivity, I'm demonstrating strength through inclusive leadership and conflict prevention. And when I state positions clearly and demand direct responses, you're demonstrating strength through decisive action and clear communication. We're both trying to be good leaders, Whiskers said wonderingly. We just define good leadership completely differently. And the asteroid belt? I prompted gently. Both aliens looked at the scattered cards and pizza crumbs, then at each other, then burst into what I can only describe as relieved laughter. Well, Whiskers laughed. Krax made that rock-tumbling sound again, but louder and more sustained. The asteroids, Krax said, shaking his massive head, contain minerals we need for our shipbuilding program. We require a reliable long-term supply. And we need those same minerals for our technological infrastructure development, Whiskers added. Plus we're concerned about environmental impact and sustainable extraction methods. So you need guaranteed access and you need it done responsibly, I said. Then you've been arguing about this for 3 months because I kept demanding immediate full access, which sounded to them like we planned to strip mine everything in sight, Krax admitted. And I kept insisting on extensive environmental impact studies and gradual implementation phases, which sounded like bureaucratic stalling to you, Whiskers concluded. Ambassador Goldstein was staring at all of us like we'd just explained how to achieve faster-than-light travel using rubber bands and good intentions. You mean the solution is joint operations with shared oversight? She asked weakly. Obviously, Krax and Whiskers said in unison, then looked at each other in surprise. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how Poker Night solved a galactic crisis that had stumped professional diplomats for 3 months. Sometimes, the best way to understand someone is to beat them at cards while sharing comfort food. Who knew? The next morning, I walked into conference room 7 Alpha whatever expecting to find Ambassador Goldstein stress-eating antacids and preparing damage control reports. Instead, I found her sitting at the head of the table, with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that gravity was actually optional. Flynn, she said as I entered with her morning coffee, I need you to explain to me how a pizza party accomplished more in 4 hours than my team managed in 3 months. Well, I said, setting down her cup, turns out when people aren't performing their jobs, they can actually do their jobs. General Krax and High Counselor Whiskers were already seated at the table, but something fundamental had changed. Krax had ditched most of his ceremonial armor for what appeared to be a more practical military uniform, and Whiskers had traded their formal diplomatic robes for something that looked comfortable enough for actual work. More importantly, they were sitting next to each other instead of across the table like opposing armies. "The human intern speaks wisdom," Krax declared, somehow making that sound like a military commendation. "When warriors share food and games, true understanding emerges." "I must admit," Whiskers added, "the informal environment did facilitate more authentic interpersonal communication than our previous structured diplomatic protocols." Ambassador Goldstein rubbed her temples. "So you're telling me that 3 months of carefully planned cultural sensitivity training was less effective than poker and pizza?" "Don't forget the part where I spilled coffee on everything," I added helpfully. "Right. Poker, pizza, and property damage." "Actually," Whiskers said, consulting what appeared to be significantly fewer notes than usual, "we've been discussing the practical implementation details since early this morning, and we believe we've identified a mutually beneficial framework for resource extraction and management." I blinked. "You've been here since early this morning? It's 7 a.m. "The Razorclaw Empire rises with the sun," Krax explained, "and Counselor Whiskers apparently does not require much sleep when engaged in productive problem-solving. I find I'm much more energetic when not spending my time worrying about accidentally offending someone," Whiskers admitted, then looked slightly startled at their own directness. Ambassador Goldstein leaned forward. "All right, let's hear it." What followed was the most efficient diplomatic presentation I'd ever witnessed, which admittedly wasn't saying much since my previous experience involved watching paint dry in 15 different languages. Krax presented their proposal with military precision: joint mining operations, with Razorclaw ships providing security and heavy extraction equipment, Fluffington teams handling environmental monitoring and processing oversight. 60-40 split on extracted materials, with the 60% going to whichever side provided the most resources for each specific operation. Whiskers outlined the regulatory framework with their typical thoroughness, but somehow made it sound reasonable instead of bureaucratic. Environmental impact assessments, yes, but streamlined ones that could be completed in weeks rather than months. Safety protocols that actually made sense, instead of covering every possible theoretical scenario in triplicate. "The key insight," Whiskers explained, "is that General Krax's direct communication style actually makes planning much more efficient when I'm not interpreting it as hostile, and my attention to environmental and safety details apparently provides strategic advantages that the General finds valuable rather than obstructive." "Your careful planning prevents resource waste and operational failures," Krax agreed. "This is excellent tactical thinking disguised as excessive politeness." "And your direct approach eliminates confusion and speeds implementation," Whiskers replied. "This is excellent leadership, disguised as controlled aggression." Ambassador Goldstein was frantically taking notes. "And the specific terms?" "Joint command structure," Krax said. "Each operation has one Razorclaw military coordinator and one Fluffington environmental coordinator. Decisions require agreement from both. Disputes go to an arbitration panel with representatives from both species, plus one neutral party. Preferably someone with experience in informal conflict resolution," Whiskers added, looking directly at me. I nearly choked on the coffee I'd been sipping. "Me? I'm an intern. I don't know anything about arbitration." "You know how to get people to stop performing their jobs and start doing their jobs," Ambassador Goldstein said slowly. "That's actually a pretty rare skill." "But I just gave them pizza and cards." "Exactly," Krax said. "No complex protocols, no hidden meanings. Simple, direct solutions to clear problems. And you created a safe space for authentic communication without cultural performance pressure," Whiskers added. "That's quite sophisticated, actually." I looked around the table at 3 of the galaxy's most important diplomatic figures, all of whom were looking at me like I'd accidentally invented fire. "You're serious? You want me to be an official arbitrator for interstellar mining disputes?" "We want you to be available for when people get so caught up in being diplomatic that they forget to solve problems," Ambassador Goldstein clarified. The formal agreement signing happened that afternoon, and it was probably the weirdest treaty ceremony in galactic history. General Krax insisted on pizza being present because it was strategically appropriate to honor the successful negotiation environment. Whiskers spent 20 minutes crafting a beautiful speech about friendship and cooperation that somehow didn't put anyone to sleep. Ambassador Goldstein handled the actual paperwork with the efficiency of someone who couldn't quite believe this was happening, but wasn't about to question good results. This treaty establishes the foundation for cooperative resource extraction in the Kepler 442 asteroid belt, she announced to the small crowd of diplomats and media representatives who'd gathered to witness either historic agreement or a spectacular diplomatic disaster. Joint operations begin in 6 weeks, Krax declared. First extraction site designated Poker 1 in honor of successful negotiation methodology. With full environmental monitoring and sustainable practices, Whiskers added, and mandatory pizza lunches for all joint planning meetings. The assembled diplomats looked confused. The media representatives looked like they weren't sure whether to report this as serious news or comedy. Ambassador Goldstein looked like she was going to need a very long vacation. And me? I looked at the treaty document with my name listed as Chief Cultural Integration Specialist and wondered how the hell I was going to explain this to my parents. Oh, and Flynn, General Krax said as the ceremony concluded. Next week, we begin regular poker games. I have much to learn about human strategic deception methods. And I've been researching Earth cuisine, Whiskers added excitedly. I'm particularly intrigued by something called nachos and would like to explore its diplomatic potential. Ambassador Goldstein patted my shoulder. Welcome to professional diplomacy, kid. Try not to accidentally solve any more major crises until I've had time to write my report. As I watched General Krax and Whiskers shake hands, then immediately start planning their next poker night, I realized something important. Sometimes the best way to solve impossible problems is to stop treating them like they're impossible and start treating them like they're just problems that need solving by actual people instead of diplomatic positions. Who would have thought? 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office, which was basically a glorified supply closet with a nameplate that read, Chief Cultural Integration Specialist, trying to explain to my college advisor why my internship had turned into a full-time job that didn't technically exist in any official diplomatic handbook. So let me understand this, Professor Martinez said over the video call, squinting at me through the screen like I was a particularly confusing equation. You accidentally solved a major interstellar crisis with gambling and junk food. That's an oversimplification, I protested. There was also property damage. And now you're officially responsible for preventing diplomatic incidents through recreational activities. When you put it like that, it sounds ridiculous. Marcus, you're 22 years old, and you're listed as a consultant on 3 separate galactic trade agreements. It is ridiculous. Fair point. The truth was, my little pizza and poker experiment had apparently started something of a trend in diplomatic circles. Word gets around fast in the galactic community, especially when it involves humans doing something unexpected that actually works. Last month, I'd mediated a territorial dispute between the crystalline hive and the nomadic traders, using something called cooperative cooking. Turns out both species had strong opinions about food preparation, and once they started arguing about proper seasoning techniques instead of star charts, they realized their territorial needs were completely compatible. 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Goldstein had asked me to observe negotiations between the Academic Confederation and the Artisan Guilds, which had been deadlocked over intellectual property rights. I introduced them to Earth trivia games. Nothing breaks down academic pretension like discovering that a master craftsman knows more obscure historical facts than a tenured professor. They ended up collaborating on a joint education program. And just yesterday, General Krax had recommended my services to the Mechanical Collective, who were having communication issues with the Empathic Circle. I was planning to try board games next week. The thing is, I told Professor Martinez, none of this should work. I don't know anything about diplomacy or alien psychology or interstellar law. I just know that when people stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be useful, problems get easier to solve. That's a remarkably mature observation from someone who once turned in a research paper written entirely in Comic Sans font. It was a stylistic choice to demonstrate my thesis about the relationship between typography and perceived authority. It was 12-point Comic Sans, Marcus. Look, the point is that humans might actually be good at this stuff. Not because we're smarter than everyone else, or stronger or more advanced, but because we're really, really good at seeing everyone else as just as ridiculous as we are. And that, I was discovering, was apparently a rare gift in the galaxy. Most species, when they reach the stars, brought their cultural complexity with them. Elaborate social hierarchies, ancient traditions, complex communication protocols that had evolved over millennia. Which was great for maintaining social order, but terrible for talking to completely alien strangers who had their own elaborate and completely incompatible systems. Humans, on the other hand, had spent most of our history being forced to interact with other human cultures that might as well have been alien. We'd gotten really good at finding common ground with people who seemed completely different from us, mostly because we'd had to in order to survive. Plus, we had pizza. Never underestimate the diplomatic power of really good comfort food. So, what's next? Professor Martinez asked. Are you planning to make a career out of accidentally solving galactic crises? I looked around my tiny office, with its collection of board games, its emergency pizza fund, and its wall covered in thank you notes written in 17 different alien languages. Through my small window, I could see New Geneva's Central Plaza, where General Krax was teaching a group of young diplomats how to play poker, while Whiskers McFluff led a seminar on authentic communication through recreational activity. Ambassador Goldstein had submitted a formal report to Earth Command recommending that informal diplomatic methods become part of standard first contact protocols. The Galactic Council was considering establishing a permanent cultural integration department, and I was pretty sure my parents still thought I was just really good at fetching coffee. You know what the funny thing is? I said to Professor Martinez. Everyone keeps acting like I invented something revolutionary, but all I did was treat alien diplomats like they were people instead of aliens. Turns out when you get past all the scales and tentacles and excessive politeness, most species want the same basic things: to be understood, to be respected, and to not have their problems dismissed as stupid. And pizza? And pizza. Never forget the pizza. After I ended the call, I sat back in my chair and thought about the bigger picture. Humanity had spent decades trying to prove we belonged among the stars by demonstrating how sophisticated and advanced we could be. Formal protocols, careful cultural studies, elaborate diplomatic procedures, designed to show that we took other species seriously. But maybe our real contribution to galactic civilization wasn't our ability to be formal and sophisticated. Maybe it was our talent for cutting through formality and sophistication when they got in the way of actually solving problems. Maybe the galaxy didn't need more diplomats who knew the proper way to address a Fluffington High Counselor in formal negotiations. Maybe it needed more people who could look at a 3-month diplomatic crisis and say, you know, this seems kind of stupid. Want to try pizza instead? My computer chimed with a new message. Another diplomatic crisis, another request for informal intervention methods. This time it was a trade dispute between the hive minds and the individual collective, which sounded like it was going to require some serious creative thinking. I opened my desk drawer and checked my emergency snack supplies. Plenty of pizza vouchers, 3 different card games, and a new addition to my toolkit, a set of cooperative puzzle games that Whiskers had recommended. Just another day in the life of the galaxy's most unqualified diplomat. But hey, at least the work was interesting, and the pizza was excellent. Besides, someone had to keep the galaxy from taking itself too seriously. Might as well be the humans. We were good at it.